The fire in the Jebel Ali industrial zone burned for precisely 37 minutes before emergency responders arrived. By then, the dark blue Lexus was nothing but a blackened skeleton, its license plate warped beyond recognition, its contents reduced to ash. When forensic investigators sifted through the remains, they found only fragments. A partially melted phone, a gold bracelet fused to what was once a wrist, and a silver voice recorder sewn into the charred remnants of a gray linen sleeve. The recorder, miraculously intact within its heat-resistant casing, contained a final message that would never reach its intended recipient. "Nene, I love you. Tell them my name. Belle Cruz. Not the mistress. Just Belle." 3 days earlier, Belle Cruz had drafted an email that was meant for 6 women, the wives of Sheikh Zain Al Mirza, media mogul and one of Dubai's most respected businessmen. The message contained no accusations, no demands for money, only a calm 4-minute video testimonial of their 3-year relationship and the promises he had made. "I do not seek to replace you," she wrote. "I only ask that my truth not be erased." But in the cached address list, a single character was wrong, hessa.ourshid@gov.ae instead of hessa.ourshid@uaegov.ae, sending the message to a spam folder rather than to the inbox of Sheikh Hessa, Zayn's newest and most powerful fiancé. This single typographical error would set in motion a desperate chain of events. 5 wives with varying reactions, a panicked Sheikh scrambling to contain the damage, a mother in Cebu whose cancer treatment hung in the balance, and Belle herself, a woman whose only crime was refusing to disappear quietly. The tragedy of Belle Cruz was not that she died in flames on a moonless night in a place where no one could hear her scream. The tragedy was that she lived as millions of expatriate women do across the Gulf states, caught between love and exploitation, promise and betrayal, visibility and erasure. Her story exposes the shadow world that exists beneath Dubai's gleaming facade, where power operates according to unwritten rules and some lives are deemed expendable in service to reputation, alliance, and wealth. This is not merely an account of murder. It is an examination of the systems that made her death not just possible, but in some terrible way, inevitable from the moment she decided that her truth deserved to be heard. The morning light in Dubai had a particular quality in October, a softened gold that filtered through Belle Cruz's sheer curtains, warming the pale walls of her Jumeirah apartment. At 29, Belle had created a sanctuary that reflected her careful nature. Bookshelves lined with Tagalog poetry and Arabic grammar texts, furniture in muted grays and creams, fresh orchids on the coffee table. A space that was both elegant and understated. Like the woman herself, the apartment revealed thoughtful restraint rather than ostentation, a quality rare in a city defined by excess. Belle moved through her morning ritual with practiced grace. Her long black hair swept into a low braid that hung between her shoulder blades, her slender frame draped in a full-sleeve linen dress in soft gray. Her movements carried the fluid economy of someone accustomed to making herself both present and invisible as circumstances required. A skill developed through years of navigating spaces where her status was perpetually in question. The expatriate experience for professional Filipino women in Gulf states involves a complex navigation of visibility, explains sociologist Dr. Maria Santillan. They exist in a liminal space, valued for their skills and education while simultaneously relegated to a social tier that demands a particular kind of self-effacement. This creates a hyper-awareness of presentation, of how one's body occupies space, of the precise calibration of assertiveness versus deference. At precisely 9 o'clock, Belle opened her laptop, adjusting its position so that the sunlight wouldn't create glare on the screen. The weekly video call with her mother in Cebu was the axis around which her Saturdays revolved, a sacred ritual that reconnected her to the reason behind every compromise, every silent negotiation, every careful step in her delicately balanced existence. Lord Cruz's face appeared on the screen, the hospital room behind her now as familiar to Belle as her own apartment. 2 years of breast cancer treatment had hollowed her mother's cheeks and thinned her once thick hair, but her eyes remained bright, alert, carrying the same fierce intelligence that had pushed Belle toward education when their neighbors in their provincial town had suggested that beauty rather than brains would be her daughter's path forward. "Magandang umaga, Nene," Belle said. the Tagalog flowing more naturally than the English and Arabic that filled her professional life. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Lord replied, her smile revealing the slight gap between her front teeth that Belle had inherited. "The new medication doesn't make me as sick. The doctor says the tumor is shrinking." The relief that washed through Belle was physical. A loosening in her chest, a lightening of the weight she carried between these weekly confirmations that her mother was still fighting, still improving, still present. The consulting fees from Sheikh Zain that funded the $12,000 monthly treatment at Cebu's premier private hospital were the financial backbone of this progress. A fact that Lord acknowledged with a mother's blend of gratitude and concern. "And your work?" Lord asked, the question carrying layers of meaning that had accumulated over the 3 years of Belle's relationship with Zain. "Is it stable?" Belle nodded, her composure a shield against the uncertainty that had been growing since Zain's last visit 2 weeks ago. "Everything is fine, Nene. The project is proceeding as planned." The fiction of Belle as a cultural consultant for Almirza Media Group had been maintained for so long that it had acquired its own reality, complete with documentation, a corporate email address, and occasional legitimate translation work that provided a veneer of professional purpose to what was, at its core, a relationship conducted in the shadows. After the call ended, Belle moved to the window, looking out at the slice of sea visible between neighboring buildings. Her mind drifted to Marawi, to the monsoon rains of 2022, to the humanitarian mission where she had first met Zain al-Mirza. Silver-haired, charismatic, fluent in Tagalog alongside his native Arabic and perfect English. He had been there to document recovery efforts after the siege, his media company producing a documentary on resilience and rebuilding. Belle, then working for an international aid organization as a cultural liaison, had been assigned as his local guide. The memory unfolded with cinematic clarity. The unexpected cloudburst that had trapped them in a half-rebuilt school, the hours of conversation that had revealed shared passions for poetry and social justice, the moment when he had looked at her with an intensity that transcended professional interest and said, "You see the world as it is and still believe in its potential. That's rare." Their connection had deepened over rain-soaked days and generator-lit nights, conversations expanding beyond the scope of the documentary to embrace philosophy, literature, dreams. When he held her hand on their final evening in Marawi and said, "When my obligations settle, I will make you my wife in every way that matters," Belle had believed him. Not blindly, she was too educated, too aware of the realities of power and privilege for that, but because he had shown her a version of himself that seemed genuine. He remembered her mother's birthday, sent medicine when supplies were scarce, cried when she told him about her father's death. He felt real in a way that made his promises feel real too. The transfer to Dubai had come 3 months later, a legitimate position with his company's cultural affairs department that soon evolved into the carefully constructed arrangement that had sustained them for the past 3 years. An apartment in a discreet building, regular business meetings that allowed them private time, gifts that were substantive but never flashy. Belle had built a life around these parameters, accepting the limitations because the alternative, returning to the Philippines, watching her mother's health deteriorate without access to treatment, was unthinkable. The economic realities of healthcare in developing nations create a particular vulnerability, notes medical ethicist Dr. Fatima Rahman. When life-saving treatment is accessible only through private means, moral calculations shift. What might seem like compromised values from the outside often represents excruciating pragmatism from within. The choice becomes not between right and wrong, but between survival and principle. The notification on Belle's phone pulled her from these reflections, a gentle chime that usually signaled a message from Zain. Instead, she found herself staring at an Instagram post from Almirza Media Group's official account. Sheikh Zain al-Mirza in pristine white kandura standing beside Sheikha Hessa bint Rashid al-Maktoum, her gold-threaded abaya catching the light, her hand resting on his arm. The caption announced their engagement, highlighting the strategic alliance between Almirza Media and the federal minister's family, the expansion opportunities the union would create, the bright future ahead. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Belle, vertigo gripping her as the carefully constructed narrative of her relationship imploded. There had been other wives, of course, 5 of them accumulated over 20 years. Belle had known this from the beginning, But Zayn had always maintained that his marriages were strategic, familial obligations rather than emotional bonds. "With you, it's different," he had whispered countless times. "You're the one I choose for myself." The Sheikh announcement was different. Her father controlled broadcast licensing across the Emirates. This was not just another marriage. It was the culmination of Zayn's ambitions, the final piece in his empire building. And in the 20-paragraph press release accompanying the post, there was not a single acknowledgement that another woman existed, that promises had been made, that 3 years of a shared life had any meaning at all. Belle did not rage. She did not break things or scream or call him demanding explanations. Instead, she sat at her small dining table, hands flat against the cool wood, and allowed grief to move through her. A current of loss that brought clarity in its wake. The pain crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. If she vanished without a trace, it would be as if she had never mattered at all. With this understanding came resolve. She would not disappear quietly into convenient erasure. She would not accept the narrative that rendered her invisible. She would insist on her own existence, her own truth, in the face of a system designed to swallow women like her without leaving ripples. Belle moved to her desk, opening her laptop with steady hands. She applied minimal makeup, arranged her hair in its usual neat braid, and pressed record on her camera. For 4 minutes and 27 seconds, she spoke directly to the lens. Her voice calm, her eyes clear, her words neither accusatory nor vengeful. She listed dates, places, promises. She displayed the wristwatch he had given her on their first anniversary, the bracelet from their weekend in Muscat, the key to this very apartment. Evidence not of scandal, but of a human connection that deserved acknowledgement. When the recording was complete, Belle composed an email addressed to all 6 of Zayn's wives, the 5 current ones and Sheikh, his bride-to-be. The message was simple, dignified, devoid of threat or demand. "I do not seek to replace you or disrupt your lives. I only ask that my truth not be erased, that my 3 years with Zayn be acknowledged as real. Not for compensation, not for status, but for the simple dignity of being seen. The attached video contains my testimony." Her finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, not from uncertainty, but from awareness of the threshold she was crossing. This action could not be undone. This truth, once released, would transform her life in ways she could not fully predict. But the alternative silent erasure, the convenient fiction that she had never existed in Zayn's world, was more painful than any consequence her action might trigger. Belle pressed send, unaware that a single character in Sheikh Hesse's cached email address, hesse.ourshid@gov.ae, instead of the correct hesse.ourshid@ue.gov.ae, would direct the message to a spam folder rather than to the inbox of the one woman whose reaction could have changed everything. This tiny digital error, insignificant in any other context, would set in motion a chain of events that would end in flames. As the email departed into the digital ether, Belle closed her laptop and made herself a cup of jasmine tea. She called her younger sister in Manila. "It's done," she said simply. "Now we wait." "For what?" her sister asked, concern evident in her voice. "For acknowledgement," Belle replied. "Even silence is an answer." If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started with Belle's journey, and the reactions to her brave stand for truth will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, vulnerability, and the true cost of visibility in a world built to protect certain narratives at any price. In the rarefied world of Emirati elite society, information traveled through carefully controlled channels, filtered through layers of discretion and protocol. But some news cut through these barriers with the precision of a surgeon's blade, especially when it threatened the delicate equilibrium of power and reputation that sustained the social order. Belle Cruz's email, landing simultaneously in the private inboxes of 5 women connected only by their shared husband, was such a disruption. A small stone creating ripples across a seemingly placid surface. Sheikh Layla Al-Mirza, Zayn's first wife of 23 years and mother of his eldest son, received the message on her personal device during her morning tea in the garden of her Al-Bersha villa. At 57, Layla had navigated the complexities of being married to an ambitious, powerful man for most of her adult life. She had watched the expansion of his household with the resigned pragmatism of a woman who understood the transaction at the heart of their arrangement. Her family's name and connections in exchange for lifetime security and the status of being first wife. A position that could never be revoked, regardless of who followed. She watched Belle's video once, her expression unchanging, her henned fingers steady as they held the phone. When it concluded, she deleted both the video and the email with methodical precision, then cleared her trash folder for good measure. The only indication that the message had affected her at all came later that evening, when her son Khalid mentioned his father's new engagement over dinner. "Your father," she said with quiet dignity, "has always been weak in ways that matter and strong in ways that don't." The cryptic statement hung in the air between them, her son too respectful to press for explanation, Layla too practiced in discretion to elaborate. But something had shifted in her perception of the man she had married, not because of the relationship with Belle, which she had suspected existed, but because of the carelessness with which he had handled it, the mess he had allowed to develop, the poor judgment that might now threaten what she valued most: stability and social standing. The reaction of the first wife in polygamous arrangements often reveals the complex power dynamics at play, explains family systems therapist Dr. Jamila Farouk. While Western observers might expect jealousy or betrayal to be the primary emotional response, it's frequently something more nuanced. Concern about disruption to established order, frustration with poor risk management, or disappointment in the husband's failure to maintain the necessary discretion that allows the system to function smoothly. Sheikh Nadia, the second wife who had joined the household 15 years ago, took a more direct approach. A businesswoman in her own right who managed a significant portion of Zayn's real estate investments, she viewed the situation through a lens of risk assessment and damage control. After watching Belle's testimony, she immediately forwarded the email to Zayn himself, adding only a terse note: "Fix this before Hessa hears. We cannot afford the Rashid connection to be compromised." Nadia's concern was not moral but practical. The engagement to Hessa represented years of careful maneuvering, of relationship building with one of the most influential families in the Emirates. The broadcast licenses that would come with the marriage would expand Al Mirza Media from a respected regional player to a global force. In Nadia's calculation, Belle Cruz was not a person but a liability. A threat to a corporate merger disguised as a marriage, a problem requiring immediate resolution. Sheikh Rima, the third wife and youngest at 34, reacted with the impulsiveness that had characterized her 7 years in the Al Mirza household. Beautiful, social media savvy, and perpetually seeking validation, Rima took a screenshot of Belle's email, carefully redacting identifying details, and sent it to a gossip blogger known for covering the whispered secrets of Gulf elite society. "Anonymous source confirms well-known media mogul's Filipino mistress making waves," she texted, alongside the image. "Possible scandal brewing." The momentary satisfaction of causing disruption quickly gave way to regret as Rima considered the potential consequences, not just for Zayn, but for her own position and the comfortable lifestyle it afforded. Within an hour, she was calling the blogger, claiming a hack of her account, demanding deletion of the message, offering exclusive coverage of an upcoming fashion show as compensation. The damage control was frantic but effective. The blogger, understanding the value of long-term access over a single scoop, agreed to bury the story. Impulsive actions in high-stakes social environments often reflect deeper insecurities, observes clinical psychologist Dr. Sarah Reynolds. The momentary release of tension through a potentially destructive act provides temporary relief from feelings of powerlessness or invisibility. But when reality sets in, when the possible consequences become clear, we see the anxiety that underlies such behavior emerge in full force. Sheikh Farah, the fourth wife and a quiet, religious woman who had always maintained a separate household away from the others, received the email during her afternoon prayer time. She watched Belle's testimony with tears in her eyes, recognizing in the young woman's dignified pain a reflection of emotions she had carefully buried during her own 12 years of marriage to Zayn. Her response was private, personal. A substantial anonymous donation to a Filipino women's shelter in Dubai, accompanied by a note requesting prayers for a sister in need of strength. She never mentioned the email to anyone, not even to Zayn during his monthly visit to her home. Her silence was not complicity but a form of compassion, a recognition that adding her voice to the situation would only escalate tensions without improving Belle's circumstances. Sheikh Amira, the fifth and most recent wife before the Hessa engagement, received the email while shopping in Mall of the Emirates. At 40, Amira had been married to Zayn for only 5 years, a union arranged to connect him to her family's banking interests. Of all the wives, she was perhaps the most emotionally invested in the ideal of her marriage, maintaining a careful fiction that theirs was a love match despite evidence to the contrary. Belle's video struck at the foundation of this narrative, revealing a Zayn who was capable of genuine emotional connection, just not with her. Amira found a quiet corner in the mall's prayer room and spent 30 minutes in silent contemplation, tears sliding beneath her designer sunglasses. When she emerged, her decision was made. She would pretend she had never seen the email. She would delete it and pray for the Filipino woman whose pain she could not acknowledge without confronting her own. The performance of contentment that had sustained her for 5 years would continue, albeit with a new understanding of its cost. Denial serves a powerful psychological function in situations where the full truth would be too painful to integrate, explains trauma specialist Dr. Kareem Malik. It's easy to dismiss such responses as weakness, but denial can be a sophisticated coping mechanism, a way of parceling out reality in manageable doses, of maintaining functional relationships and social identities while gradually processing information that threatens our core understanding of our lives. As these varied reactions unfolded across Dubai, Sheikh Zayn Al Mirza sat in his penthouse office in the Dubai International Financial Center, staring at Nadia's forwarded email with a growing sense of panic. The video played on his screen, Belle's calm voice narrating their shared history with a precision that left no room for denial. The evidence was specific, detailed, irrefutable: dates, locations, gifts that could be traced to his accounts, promises spoken in private but now preserved in digital testimony. His initial assumption was catastrophic, that all 6 women, including Hessa, had received this documentation of his betrayal. The engagement to Hessa represented the culmination of his ambitions, the final piece in a career built on strategic relationships and careful image management. Her father, Federal Minister Rashid, controlled not just broadcast licensing but regulatory oversight for media operations throughout the UAE. If Hessa felt publicly humiliated, the alliance would collapse, taking with it not just future opportunities but potentially threatening existing operations. With hands that betrayed an uncharacteristic tremor, Zayn dialed Belle's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice composed, betraying none of the emotion that must have driven her action. "Why did you do this?" he demanded, struggling to keep his tone even, aware that displays of anger would only confirm the portrait she had painted in her testimony. "Because you made me believe I was more than a secret," Belle replied, the simple truth landing with more force than any accusation could have. "Because you created a world where I mattered, then expected me to disappear from it without a trace when it became inconvenient." "I can make this right," he said, shifting to the negotiation skills that had built his empire. $500,000. A fresh start anywhere you want to go. Your mother's treatment fully funded for life. Just leave Dubai. Today. The offer hung between them, substantial by any objective measure, life-changing for most people in Belle's position. But her response made clear that the currency of their conflict wasn't financial. "I don't want your money, Zayn," she said, her voice softening slightly at the use of his name. "I want you to say my name in front of your wives. I want you to acknowledge that I existed, that what we shared was real. That's all I've ever wanted." The simplicity of her request, recognition, acknowledgement, the dignity of being seen, was precisely what made it impossible. To grant Belle this basic humanity would require dismantling the compartmentalized world Zayn had constructed, where different versions of himself existed in carefully separated spaces, never intended to converge. "You're being unreasonable," he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "You always knew the situation. You accepted it for 3 years." "I accepted it because you promised it was temporary," Belle countered. "Because you said when your obligations settled, I would be your wife in every way that matters." "Those were your exact words, Zayn." In Marawi during the monsoon. You held my hand and promised me a future. Was any of it real? The question penetrated his practiced defenses, touching something that might, in another man, have been conscience. But Zayn had spent decades cultivating a self that existed primarily in relation to his ambitions, his needs, his vision for his legacy. Whatever genuine feeling had existed for Belle, and there had been moments of real connection, of authentic sharing, was now subordinated to the more pressing concern of containing the damage she represented. As the call ended, Zayn made another, this one to a contact saved simply as Rashid. Not the federal minister, but a man whose services were known in certain circles for resolving sensitive situations with discretion. The conversation was brief, the instructions carefully phrased to maintain plausible deniability. There's a situation requiring management. A woman making unreasonable demands. No violence, nothing extreme. Just pressure to encourage her departure from the Emirates. Generous compensation will be offered. The goal is simply compliance. As Zayn ended the second call, he glanced at his calendar. A dinner with Hessa and her father scheduled for that evening, where final details of the marriage contract would be discussed. The timing could not have been worse. If Belle's email reached Hessa before he could contain the situation, everything he had built over decades could collapse in a single evening of awkward questions and wounded pride. Meanwhile, in her Jumeirah apartment, Belle was taking steps of her own. The response to her email, or lack thereof from most recipients, had confirmed what she already suspected. That the system was designed to absorb and neutralize challenges to its equilibrium, that women in her position were expected to accept erasure as the natural conclusion to their stories. But Belle Cruz, whose mother had sacrificed everything to educate her, whose father had died believing his daughter would never need to compromise her dignity for survival, was not prepared to disappear without ensuring her truth remained on record. She contacted a Filipino human rights lawyer known for representing migrant workers in disputes with powerful employers. She began drafting a formal statement, not for media attention or public scandal, but for legal protection, a documented account that would exist in official records regardless of what happened next. She called her mother in Cebu, careful to share only enough information to explain potential disruptions in communication without causing undue worry. Things may be complicated for a while, she said, keeping her tone light, but I'm finally choosing myself, Nene, the way you always taught me to. The decision to formally document one's experience in potentially dangerous situations represents both a practical safety measure and a powerful act of self-reclamation, notes victimology expert Dr. Elena Martinez. By creating an official record, individuals like Belle are refusing the erasure that systems of power often rely upon. The statement becomes both shield and testimony, protection against further harm and assertion that one's truth matters enough to be preserved. As darkness fell over Dubai, the gleaming lights of the city creating the illusion of a place where dreams were realized rather than compromised, the machinery set in motion by Belle's email continued its inexorable operation. 5 wives processed their knowledge according to their individual priorities and perspectives. Zayn mobilized resources to contain what he viewed as a threat to everything he had built. Belle prepared herself for whatever consequences her stand for truth might bring. And somewhere in the digital ether, an email addressed to hessa.alrashid@gov.ai sat unread in a spam folder. A single character error that would prove fatal to the woman who had dared to insist on her right to be acknowledged. If this exploration of power, vulnerability, and the courage to demand visibility has resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for our next segment. As Zayn's desperation grows and Belle refuses to be silenced, the trap disguised as opportunity begins to close around her, revealing the true cost of challenging a system built to protect power at any price. The notification arrived at 10:17 a.m., a text message from an unknown number, its formal language immediately setting it apart from Belle's usual communications. Ms. Cruz, this is Omar Reyes from the Philippine Consulate's Expatriate Affairs Division. Your residency visa is under urgent review due to moral conduct concerns. Please contact this number immediately to discuss your status. Belle stared at the message, her tea growing cold beside her laptop where she had been drafting her legal statement. The phrasing was precise in its ambiguity, designed to trigger the specific anxiety that lived in the heart of every overseas worker. Visa status, the fragile legal foundation upon which their entire existence in foreign lands depended. Without it, everything collapsed: income, housing, healthcare access, the ability to support family at home. For Belle, whose mother's treatment relied on her continued presence in Dubai, visa revocation represented not just personal disruption but a potential death sentence for the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. Visa-related threats are particularly effective against expatriate workers because they exploit a foundational vulnerability, explains immigration attorney Hassan Al-Mansouri. Even highly educated professionals exist in a state of permanent precarity, where their right to remain is contingent on employer approval, spotless behavioral records, and compliance with often vaguely defined moral standards. This creates a perfect leverage point for those seeking to control or manipulate them. With trembling fingers, Belle returned the call, her mind racing through possible explanations. Had Zain reported her for extortion? Had one of the wives filed a complaint? Was this connected to her email, or merely unfortunate timing? The man who answered introduced himself as Omar Reyes, his Filipino surname lending an immediate credibility, his tone professional but sympathetic, one countryman helping another navigate bureaucratic complications. Miss Cruz, I apologize for the alarm, but it's better you hear this from us before formal proceedings begin, he explained. An anonymous complaint has been lodged regarding your relationship with a prominent Emirati citizen. Such allegations trigger automatic visa review under moral conduct provisions. Belle's hand tightened around the phone. What exactly am I being accused of? The specifics aren't important at this stage, Omar replied, his voice lowering conspiratorially. What matters is procedural intervention before this reaches the formal review committee. We have a special liaison office that helps expatriates in delicate situations. If you cooperate fully, we can likely resolve this administratively. The offer dangled before her, not salvation, but a path toward it, a bureaucratic escape route that appealed to her practical nature. Belle had lived in Dubai long enough to understand that such backchannel resolutions were often legitimate, part of a system designed to handle sensitive matters with minimum disruption. What do I need to do? She asked, caution tempering the hope in her voice. A confidential meeting tomorrow morning to record your statement. I'll text you the address. Bring your passport and visa documentation. Wear professional attire. Be prepared to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the complaint details. The instructions were precise, official-sounding, aligned with what Belle would expect from legitimate consular intervention. She agreed to the meeting, ending the call with a polite salamat pa that acknowledged the man's perceived authority and Filipino connection. Only after setting down her phone did Belle notice she was shaking, a delayed physical reaction to the threat of losing everything she had built. She moved to the window, seeking centering in the familiar view. The Dubai skyline shimmered in the midday heat, the architectural impossibilities that had once represented opportunity now taking on a more ominous aspect. A beautiful facade concealing machinery that could crush individuals who stepped out of line. The exploitation of cultural familiarity is a sophisticated manipulation tactic, observes cultural psychologist Dr. Nina Santos. When someone from your own background appears to offer assistance, it bypasses certain defensive mechanisms. The shared language, cultural references, and implied solidarity create an almost immediate trust, particularly in environments where expatriates often feel isolated from their home culture. What Belle couldn't know was that Omar Reyes was actually Faisal Mahmoud, one of Rashid's associates, a Jordanian who had spent enough time in the Philippines to acquire convincing linguistic patterns and cultural knowledge. The trap was being constructed with meticulous attention to detail, designed specifically for Belle's particular vulnerabilities: her visa status, her mother's medical needs, her Filipino identity. That afternoon, Belle received another message, this one from her mother's oncologist in Cebu, confirming the next round of treatment scheduled for the following week. The timing seemed to underscore the stakes of her situation. One wrong move, one bureaucratic misstep, and the lifeline-sustaining lure would be severed. Belle forwarded the treatment schedule to her sister in Manila with a brief note. If anything happens, make sure Nene gets to these appointments. I'll explain later. As twilight settled over Dubai, casting long shadows across her apartment, Belle's security guard called from the lobby. Ms. Cruz, Sheikh Zain Al Mirza left a package for you. Shall I send it up? The surprise of hearing Zain's name spoken so openly, a rare breach of the discretion that had characterized their relationship, momentarily stunned her. Yes, please. Thank you. The package arrived minutes later, a simple manila envelope bearing no external markings. Inside, Belle found a handwritten note on Zain's personal stationery, the familiar slant of his Arabic-influenced handwriting sending an involuntary pang through her chest. Belle, go to Manila. Today, if possible. I'll take care of Lourdes, her treatment, everything she needs. I give you my word. Please do this. For both our sakes. See, the note contained no reference to her email, no acknowledgement of the pain she had expressed, no engagement with her request for recognition. Just an urgent plea for her departure, dressed as concern but reeking of panic. The impersonal brevity after 3 years of intimacy struck Belle with unexpected force. The final confirmation, if she needed it, that she had always been a complication rather than a person in his calculus. Such communications often reveal the true nature of power imbalances in relationships, notes relationship therapist Dr. Samira Kazemi. When crisis emerges, the facade of equality dissolves, exposing the underlying transactional framework. The abrupt shift from intimate partner to problem requiring resolution represents a profound psychological violence. The erasure not just of the relationship but of the shared reality it represented. Belle placed the note on her coffee table, considering her options with the analytical clarity that had characterized her professional success. Returning to Manila would mean abandoning the truth she had fought to establish, accepting erasure, allowing Zain's narrative to prevail. Staying meant facing whatever consequences her stand might bring. Visa complications, financial uncertainty, potential public exposure. The practical choice was clear. The moral one was clearer. She called her lawyer, scheduling an appointment for the following afternoon, after the consulate meeting but before Zain might take more drastic action. She packed an emergency bag with essential documents, medications, and enough clothing for several days. She backed up her evidence to multiple secure cloud locations, ensuring that her truth could not be easily erased. These were not the actions of someone planning to flee, but of someone preparing for battle on multiple fronts. What Belle didn't know was that Rashid, sensing Zain's wavering resolve, had already escalated the situation beyond his client's explicit instructions. After observing Belle's lawyer entering her building, he called Zain directly. "She's meeting with attorneys," he reported, his tone suggesting urgent crisis. "Filipino human rights lawyers with international connections. If she files formal documentation, Sheikh Hessa will learn everything, even if she didn't receive the original email. The narrative will be beyond your control." Zain sat in his penthouse office, the city lights spread before him like a carpet of stars, the empire he had built now seemingly hanging by the thread of Belle's discretion. The engagement dinner with Hessa and her father had gone smoothly the previous evening, the contracts nearly finalized, the merger of families and business interests proceeding according to plan. All of it now threatened by a woman who simply wanted the dignity of acknowledgement. "What are you suggesting?" he asked Rashid, his voice carefully neutral, maintaining the fiction that he was, merely seeking professional advice rather than authorizing action. "More direct intervention," Rashid replied. "The consulate approach may not be sufficient. We need to ensure her complete withdrawal from the situation." "No violence," Zain said automatically, the same instruction he had given initially. "Just make sure she understands what's at stake. For everyone." The careful ambiguity of the exchange allowed both men to maintain their self-image. Zain as a businessman protecting legitimate interests rather than a man silencing an inconvenient woman. Rashid as a security consultant rather than an enforcer of patriarchal control. The euphemisms created comfortable distance between intention and consequence, between ordering action and responsibility for its results. The following morning, Belle dressed with particular care for her consulate meeting. A modest navy pantsuit, minimal jewelry, hair secured in a professional bun. Her appearance was a conscious choice, an armor of respectability that she hoped would lend weight to her case. She tucked her phone into an inner pocket, a small voice recorder sewn into her sleeve. Precautions that felt melodramatic but necessary given the stakes involved. The address led her to a nondescript office building in Dara, the older commercial district where rental spaces were affordable and business turnover high. The lobby directory listed Philippine Consular Services, Suite 407, in recently applied lettering, a detail that triggered the first flutter of suspicion in Belle's mind. She had visited the main Philippine consulate multiple times during her years in Dubai, and while outreach offices existed, they were usually well-established and prominently marked. The elevator ascended to the 4th floor, opening to a corridor that felt eerily quiet for a weekday morning. Suite 407 bore a hastily printed sign matching the lobby directory, the door slightly ajar. Belle paused, instinct warring with hope, the desire to believe in institutional protection battling the growing certainty that something was wrong. She pushed the door open to find a Spartan office. A desk, 3 chairs, a filing cabinet, a UAE flag in the corner. The man who rose to greet her matched the voice from the phone. Filipino features, mid-40s, business attire, an official-looking ID badge clipped to his lapel. Everything designed to project legitimacy, to allay the suspicions now coalescing in Belle's mind. "Ms. Cruz, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward a chair opposite the desk. "We can begin the documentation process immediately." Belle remained standing, her gaze sweeping the room, noting the absence of computers, printers, the standard equipment of a functioning consular office. The walls were bare of the usual photographs of Philippine landmarks, official certificates, diplomatic credentials. "Where are the other staff?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. "Consular offices always have multiple personnel." Omar's smile tightened fractionally. "As I mentioned, this is a special division for sensitive cases. Discretion requires limited personnel." Belle took a deliberate step back toward the door. "I'd like to see your official identification, please, and the office's consular registration." The request, reasonable, procedural, impossible for a legitimate official to refuse, hung in the air between them. Omar's expression shifted, the mask of helpful countryman slipping to reveal calculation beneath. "Ms. Cruz, you're making this more complicated than necessary," he said, his tone hardening. "We're trying to help you avoid deportation. Your situation is precarious, especially given your relationship with Sheikh Al-Mirza." The direct mention of Zain, something a legitimate consular officer would approach with diplomatic circumspection, confirmed what Belle already knew. This was no official meeting, no bureaucratic lifeline. It was a trap, dressed in the language and trappings of institutional protection. Belle's hand closed around her phone in her pocket, her thumb finding the emergency call function by touch. "I think we're done here. I'll address any visa concerns directly with the main consulate." As she turned to leave, the door behind her opened fully, revealing a second man. Larger, expressionless, clearly not part of any consular service. The sight of him blocking the exit crystallized the danger of her situation with brutal clarity. What happened next was not the product of careful planning but of pure survival instinct. Belle feigned a stumble, using the momentum to duck past the second man, her smaller frame an element of surprise creating just enough space for her to slip through the doorway. She ran for the stairwell rather than the elevator, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, awareness narrowing to the immediate escape route. Behind her, she heard Omar's voice. "Stop her!" All pretense of official procedure abandoned. The stairwell door closed behind her with a heavy clang as she began descending the concrete steps 2 at a time, the sound of pursuit echoing from above. 4 floors, 16 flights, each step a prayer, each landing a minor victory. Belle emerged into the building's back alley, sunlight momentarily blinding after the dim stairwell. She ran toward the main street, toward people, toward witnesses and the relative safety of public space. Only when she reached a crowded shopping area 2 blocks away did she slow, blending into the flow of pedestrians while dialing her lawyer's number with shaking hands. As she waited for the connection, Belle activated the voice recorder in her sleeve, speaking clearly despite her labored breathing. "My name is Belle Cruz. I was just lured to a fake Philippine consulate office in Dara by men claiming to be officials. I believe this is connected to my relationship with Sheikh Zain al-Mirza and my recent communication with his wives. If anything happens to me, Zain is responsible." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then added with quiet determination, "I'm uploading this recording to a secure cloud server with a 72-hour auto-send trigger. If I don't reset it, this message, along with all my evidence, will be sent to international human rights organizations, media outlets, and legal authorities." The recording was not just documentation but insurance. A digital dead man's switch designed to ensure that her truth would survive even if she did not. Belle didn't know if it would be enough to protect her, but it established what she had insisted upon from the beginning: that her existence, her experience, and her voice mattered enough to be preserved. As her lawyer answered, Belle ducked into a small cafe, finding a corner seat with a view of both entrances. "I need to meet you immediately," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I'm being actively targeted. I need protection and legal documentation today." What she couldn't know was that across the city, in his DIFC penthouse, Zain was receiving a very different account of the morning's events. Rashid's call painted Belle not as a woman escaping danger but as a calculated threat escalating her demands. "She's implementing a blackmail protocol," he reported, the terminology deliberately chosen to trigger Zain's business instincts rather than his conscience. "Auto-send messages, legal documentation, international contacts. This is no longer a personal matter. It's a coordinated attempt at reputation destruction." Zain stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city that had been the canvas for his ambitions, the empire he had built from calculated decisions and strategic relationships. The merger announcement with Sheikh Hessa's family was scheduled for publication in the Financial Times the following morning. The contracts were prepared. The future he had worked toward for decades was within reach. And now this, a woman refusing erasure, insisting on recognition, threatening everything not through malice but through the simple, devastating act of speaking her truth. "Make sure she never speaks again," he said finally, the words emerging with a coldness that surprised even him. He didn't say, "Kill her." He didn't need to. The instruction hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable despite its careful phrasing. Rashid acknowledged with a simple "understood." The brevity sealing the contract between them, a death ordered in euphemism, to be carried out with professional detachment. Another problem resolved in service to power and ambition. If this unflinching portrait of vulnerability and power has affected you, make sure to subscribe for our next segment. The trap is set, the decision made, and Belle now enters the final hours of her life, fighting not just for survival, but for the dignity of being remembered. What follows will challenge everything you thought you knew about the price of truth in a world designed to protect certain narratives at any cost. The Jebel Ali industrial zone existed in a state of perpetual twilight. The harsh desert sun filtered through a permanent haze of dust and diesel exhaust, the landscape dominated by warehouses and storage facilities stretching toward the horizon in a monotonous grid. By day, the area hummed with the activity of global commerce. Shipping containers being loaded and unloaded, workers moving between facilities, trucks rumbling along access roads. But as darkness fell, the zone transformed into a ghost town of shuttered buildings and empty lots, the perfect setting for matters requiring privacy and discretion. Belle had spent the afternoon in her lawyer's office, documenting her relationship with Zain, the recent threats, and the fake consulate trap in painstaking detail. The formal statement had been notarized, copies secured in multiple locations, a preliminary filing made with the Philippine Embassy's labor attaché. These were not just legal precautions but acts of existential assertion. Formal records establishing that Belle Cruz had lived, had experienced, had mattered enough to leave a documented trace. "I should leave Dubai," she acknowledged as the meeting concluded, practical reality asserting itself through her determination, at least temporarily, until the legal protections are fully in place. Her lawyer, Attorney Maria Santos, nodded grimly. "I can arrange emergency repatriation through official channels. It would take 48 hours, but with embassy involvement, you'd have some protection during the waiting period." The plan was reasonable, cautious, aligned with Belle's characteristic pragmatism. She would stay with a colleague from her aid organization days, someone outside Zane's sphere of influence. She would maintain communication blackout except for essential legal matters. She would be on a plane to Manila by the weekend, her truth preserved in official records even as she physically retreated. The text message that destroyed this careful plan arrived at 8:43 p.m. as Belle was packing a small overnight bag in her apartment. The number was unfamiliar, but the content sent ice through her veins. Ms. Cruz, this is Dr. Reyes from Cebu Doctors Hospital. Your mother's treatment authorization has been canceled due to payment issues. We need emergency confirmation to continue the scheduled procedures. Please call immediately. Belle stared at the message, her mind racing through implications, calculating possibilities. The timing was too perfect, the threat too precisely targeted at her one unbreachable vulnerability. This had to be another trap, another manipulation designed to force her into the open. And yet, what if it wasn't? What if Zane had indeed canceled the payments that sustained her mother's treatment? The possibility, however remote, that her mother might suffer as a consequence of her actions was a risk Belle could not take. Emotional leverage represents the most sophisticated form of coercion, explains hostage negotiation expert Thomas Reynolds. When physical threats may be disregarded, when financial pressure might be resisted, threatening harm to a loved one, particularly a parent or child, almost always succeeds. It bypasses rational assessment and activates primal protective instincts that override self-preservation. Belle called the number, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the digits. The man who answered identified himself as Dr. Reyes, his voice carrying the authoritative concern of a medical professional dealing with an urgent situation. Your mother's treatment cannot proceed without confirmation of financial responsibility, he explained. The hospital received notice that the standing payment arrangement has been terminated. We need you to come sign emergency authorization papers to prevent interruption. This can't be right, Belle said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The payments are automated through Al Mirza Foundation. There should be no interruption. I'm just relaying what our financial department has informed me, the voice replied with practiced patience. The authorization was explicitly canceled today. Without immediate intervention, tomorrow's treatment will be postponed indefinitely. Given your mother's condition, any delay could be significant. The implied threat to her mother's survival hung in the air, its power magnified by the distance separating Belle from Cebu, by her inability to verify the situation independently given the late hour in the Philippines. She found herself calculating risks, weighing options, seeking a path that would protect both her mother and herself. Where do I need to sign these papers? She asked finally, decision crystallizing even as warning bells continued to sound in her mind. The address provided was in Jebel Ali Industrial Zone, a location that made little logical sense for medical documentation but aligned perfectly with a scenario designed to isolate her. Belle recognized the trap even as she felt herself being drawn toward it, her love for her mother creating a vulnerability that no amount of legal preparation or personal courage could overcome. I'll be there in an hour, she said, the words feeling like surrender even as she spoke them. What followed was a study in tragic determination. Belle did not walk blindly into danger. She prepared as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. She texted her lawyer the address and situation, setting a check-in deadline. If you don't hear from me by 11 p.m., activate the emergency protocols we discussed. She programmed her auto-send cloud messages to trigger if not reset within 12 hours. She concealed her voice recorder in her sleeve, ensuring it was actively recording. She tucked her mother's rosary into her pocket, a talisman of connection, of purpose, of the love that both made her vulnerable and gave her strength. The taxi driver who took her to Jebel Ali seemed puzzled by the destination and hour, but asked no questions beyond confirming the address. As they drove through the deserted industrial landscape, Belle watched the lights of central Dubai recede in the rear window, the glittering promise of the city giving way to the utilitarian darkness of its economic engine room. The journey felt symbolic, a movement from illusion to reality, from the Dubai of postcards and promotional videos to the Dubai of labor camps and industrial zones, the hidden infrastructure that made the glamour possible. The warehouse they eventually reached stood isolated at the end of a service road, a single external light illuminating a metal door in an otherwise featureless concrete facade. No signage, no indication of purpose or ownership, just another anonymous box in a landscape of identical structures. The taxi departed after Belle paid, the red taillights diminishing into the distance until she stood alone in the harsh circle of the security light, the weight of her decision settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a man whose features confirmed what Belle already knew. This was no medical facility, no legitimate business office. The man's face betrayed nothing as he gestured for her to enter, his silence more threatening than any verbal intimidation could have been. The interior space was vast, empty except for a small office area constructed in one corner. A desk, several chairs, a file cabinet creating the illusion of normal business operations in what was clearly a temporarily repurposed storage facility. Belle's gaze swept across the concrete floor, noting the drains built into the surface, the utility sink in the far corner, the practical features that allowed the space to be thoroughly cleaned. Her mind flinched away from the implications of these observations, from the stories such features could tell if concrete could speak. Rashid waited beside the desk, his bearing professionally neutral, his eyes assessing Belle with the detached interest of someone examining a technical problem rather than a human being. "Miss Cruz, thank you for coming. Where are the papers for my mother's treatment?" Belle asked, cutting directly to the pretense that had brought her here, refusing to acknowledge the obvious reality of her situation. "There are no papers," Rashid replied, not bothering to maintain the fiction now that it had served its purpose. "Your mother's treatment continues uninterrupted. For now." The qualifier hung in the air between them, its meaning unmistakable. Belle felt a complex emotion rise within her. Relief that her mother was not in immediate danger. Rage at the manipulation that had lured her here, and beneath both, a cold certainty about what would follow. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, her hand finding her mother's rosary in her pocket, fingers closing around the familiar beads. "Your cooperation," Rashid said, as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than her continued existence. "Sheikh Al-Mirza has been generous in his offer. $500,000. Complete medical care for your mother. A fresh start anywhere outside the Emirates." The offer, substantial by any objective measure, was presented not as negotiation but as the recitation of terms already decided, a fait accompli requiring only her signature to formalize. On the desk lay a document, legal language visible even from where Belle stood, the heading Settlement and Non-Disclosure Agreement, prominently displayed. "And if I refuse?" Belle asked, though she already knew the answer, could read it in the clinical efficiency of the space, in the presence of the silent man now blocking the door behind her. Rashid's expression didn't change. "Then arrangements will be made to ensure your permanent silence through other means." The threat was delivered with the same professional detachment he might use to discuss logistics or security protocols. Not personal, not emotional, simply a statement of procedural alternatives. Belle felt time slow around her, each heartbeat stretching as her mind processed her options, seeking a path through impossible terrain. "My mother has no one else," she said finally, the words emerging not as plea but as statement of fact. "Let me call her. Let me say goodbye at least." Something flickered briefly across Rashid's features, not compassion exactly, but perhaps recognition of the human element he had been trained to disregard. Professional distance wavering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "That won't be possible." As he spoke, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, a flash of tension crossing his face as he recognized the number. "Excuse me," he said, stepping slightly aside to answer. "Yes." Belle couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but the single word of Rashid's response told her everything she needed to know. Almost. The word contained her entire future, compressed into 2 syllables. Almost finished. Almost erased. Almost a problem resolved rather than a person remembered. In that moment, Belle felt a strange clarity descend, a focusing of purpose that transcended fear. If this was to be her end, it would not be a silent disappearance, An unnamed statistic, a convenient erasure. She would leave a trace, a testimony, a truth that even flames could not consume. Slowly, deliberately, she activated the voice recorder in her sleeve, her lips barely moving as she whispered into the hidden microphone. "Nene, I love you. Tell them my name. Belle Cruz. Not the mistress. Just Belle." The simplicity of the request, to be remembered as herself, not as an appendage to a powerful man's story, contained the essence of everything she had fought for since sending that fateful email. Not revenge, not compensation, not even justice in any conventional sense. Just acknowledgement, just the dignity of being seen. Across the city, in his penthouse overlooking the marina, Zayn al-Mirza sat alone with a glass of non-alcoholic whiskey, staring at a photograph on his phone. Belle and Marawi, caught in a moment of unexpected joy as rain poured around her, her face tilted upward to catch the drops, laughing despite the discomfort. He had taken the picture himself, 3 years and a lifetime ago, when possibility had seemed infinite and consequences comfortably distant. His finger hovered over Rashid's contact information, a momentary hesitation interrupting the smooth flow of events he had set in motion. Something that might, in another man, have been conscience-stirring beneath the practiced calculations of advantage and liability. A recognition, perhaps, that the woman he had shared his thoughts with for 3 years, who had held him through the anniversary of his father's death, who had seen parts of himself he showed to no one else, deserved more than this industrial erasure. The moment stretched, poised between action and inaction, between intervention and complicity. Then his phone buzzed with an incoming call, the screen lighting up with Minister Rashid Al Maktoum, Hessa's father, the man whose approval would cement Zayn's legacy, whose partnership would transform his media empire from regional player to global force. Zayn silenced the call, setting his phone face down on the marble side table. He poured another whiskey, larger this time, and moved to the window. The city spread before him like a carpet of light, a monument to ambition and calculation, to the pursuit of more regardless of cost. He had made his choice the moment he called Rashid, had committed to a course that could not be undone without consequences he was unwilling to bear. Whatever momentary doubt had surfaced was already receding, submerged beneath the weight of everything he had built, everything he stood to gain, everything he feared to lose. Back in the warehouse, events proceeded with the terrible efficiency of long practice. Belle was restrained, her attempts at resistance futile against superior strength and preparation. Her purse was taken, her phone confiscated, the voice recorder in her sleeve overlooked in the methodical but not exhaustive search. She was moved to a dark blue Lexus parked inside the warehouse, a vehicle selected for its common profile and unremarkable appearance. What happened next would never appear in any police report, would never be officially acknowledged by any authority. The clinical details matter less than the human reality. That Belle Cruz, who had lived with dignity and fought for recognition, faced her end with the same quiet courage that had characterized her stand for truth. That her final thoughts were of her mother, her final words a prayer, her final act an assertion of identity that refused erasure even in death. Rashid's methods were professional, detached, focused on efficiency rather than cruelty. The car was positioned carefully, the accelerant applied with methodical precision, the process managed to ensure minimum evidence and maximum effect. When he finally struck the match, his expression revealed nothing, no satisfaction, no regret, simply the blank completion of a task assigned and executed according to parameters. The flames rose quickly, consuming the vehicle with hungry efficiency, the heat intense enough to warp metal and melt plastic, to transform a human being into unidentifiable ash. By the time emergency services would respond, alerted by an anonymous call placed from a burner phone, there would be nothing left but a blackened skeleton of a car, its license plate unrecognizable, its contents reduced to fragments of bone and metal. But what the fire could not reach, could not destroy, was the silver voice recorder protected by its heat-resistant casing, sewn into the charred remnants of a gray linen sleeve. A small, technological miracle preserving Belle's final message: "Nene, I love you. Tell them my name. Belle Cruz. Not the mistress. Just Belle." A simple request that contained a revolution, the insistence that her humanity be recognized, that her existence be acknowledged, that her truth survive the flames designed to consume it. In death as in life, Belle Cruz fought not for vengeance but for visibility, not for punishment but for the fundamental dignity of being seen. This devastating portrait of power and vulnerability reveals the true cost of challenging systems designed to protect certain narratives at any price. If Belle's story has moved you, her courage in the face of erasure, her stand for dignity against overwhelming odds, join us for our final segments, where we witness the aftermath of her death and the unexpected ways her truth refuses to be silenced. Some fires are set to destroy evidence, but others illuminate truths that might otherwise remain hidden in darkness. Subscribe now to follow this story to its powerful conclusion. The Dubai police headquarters in Al Murakabat stood like a fortress of order in the chaotic urban landscape, its imposing facade representing the authoritative finality with which certain narratives were established and maintained. Inside the forensics department on the third floor, Detective Saeed Al-Mansouri reviewed the preliminary report on the vehicle fire in Jebel Ali. A dark blue Lexus, license plate rendered unidentifiable by extreme heat, a single victim whose remains were too severely damaged for immediate identification. The cause was listed as likely mechanical failure, a determination made with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that characterized cases where deeper investigation might prove inconvenient to certain interests. The forensic assessment of suspicious fires follows predictable patterns in jurisdictions where power intersects with justice, explains former criminal investigator Dr. James Reynolds. What appears as procedural thoroughness, detailed temperature analyses, chemical residue testing, structural examination, often masks a superficial investigation designed to reach predetermined conclusions. The science serves not truth but convenience, establishing plausible deniability rather than factual certainty. Detective Al-Mansouri was neither corrupt nor incompetent. He was simply experienced enough to recognize certain signatures: the location in an industrial zone with minimal surveillance, the complete destruction of identifying features, the absence of witnesses despite the spectacular nature of a vehicle fire. These were markers of what his colleagues euphemistically called resolved matters, cases where investigation beyond the minimum protocol would yield no career advancement but might create significant professional complications. The detective signed the report, classifying the incident as accidental death pending identification, a designation that ensured the case would remain in administrative limbo, neither fully closed nor actively pursued. The file would join hundreds of others in the digital archives, a bureaucratic ghost that existed only as data points and procedural compliance, the human element carefully excised. In the Cebu Doctors' Hospital, 4,300 miles away, Lourdes Cruz sat beside her window watching rain streak the glass, unaware that her daughter had ceased to exist. The treatment that had been scheduled for that morning had proceeded without interruption, the funds arriving as they always did, the medical staff noting nothing unusual about the Filipino woman with thinning hair and determined eyes. Lourdes had tried calling Belle the night before, concerned about the uncharacteristic brevity of their recent communications, but had attributed the unanswered call to her daughter's busy schedule. The silence that surrounded Belle's disappearance was not just the absence of information but an active construction, a carefully managed void designed to create the impression that nothing unusual had occurred. Her apartment remained untouched, rent automatically deducted from her account as it had been for 3 years. Her position at Al Mirza Media Group's Cultural Affairs Department, the official cover for her relationship with Zain, was neither terminated nor reassigned, simply allowed to exist in administrative suspension. Her social media accounts remained active but dormant, the algorithms continuing to suggest connections and memories, as if she were simply taking a digital break rather than permanently absent from the world. The most effective disappearances are those that masquerade as ordinary absences, observes disappeared persons expert Dr. Elena Santiago. When someone vanishes without institutional acknowledgement, no missing persons report, no formal investigation, no media coverage, they enter a state of liminal non-existence. They are neither officially dead nor verifiably alive, but suspended in an administrative purgatory that serves powerful interests by avoiding the complications of either condition. This cultivated ambiguity might have succeeded completely if not for 3 factors that disrupted the careful construction of silence. Belle's auto-send cloud message, her lawyer's emergency protocols, and, most consequentially, the technical error that had prevented her original email from reaching Sheikh Hessa. Attorney Maria Santos had waited until precisely 11 p.m. on the night of Belle's disappearance, the deadline they had established for the check-in call that never came. With growing dread, she initiated the emergency measures they had discussed, contacting the Philippine consulate with a formal report, submitting Belle's notarized statement to international human rights organizations, and activating legal mechanisms designed to create official documentation of a disappearance that powerful interests would prefer to remain unrecorded. Simultaneously, Belle's cloud storage system, detecting no reset of the 12-hour countdown, automatically forwarded her final recorded testimony to pre-designated recipients, her lawyer, the Philippine consulate, and several international human rights organizations. The message created an official record that could not be easily erased, a digital testament to Belle's existence and the circumstances surrounding her silence. But it was the third disruption, the one Belle could never have anticipated, that would prove most consequential. 3 days after the Jebel Ali fire, Sheikh Nadia, increasingly concerned about potential fallout from Belle's allegations, took the extraordinary step of forwarding the original email directly to Sheikh Hessa, accompanied by a terse note. "You should be aware of this situation before the wedding. Better to hear it from family than strangers." The email reached Hessa as she sat in her private office in her father's villa, reviewing final details for the wedding scheduled to take place in less than a month. The daughter of Federal Minister Rashid Al Maktoum was not just a political asset but a formidable intellect in her own right, educated at LSE and Harvard Business School, fluent in 5 languages, and possessed of the shrewd analytical mind that had made her family's name synonymous with strategic acumen. She watched Belle's video testimony with an expressionless face that revealed nothing of the calculations occurring behind her carefully neutral gaze. The footage showed not a vindictive mistress but a composed young woman presenting evidence of a 3-year relationship conducted with Zane's full participation and encouragement. Belle's dignity, her refusal to demand or threaten, her simple request for acknowledgement rather than compensation, these elements registered with Hessa not as weakness but as a moral clarity that stood in stark contrast to the carefully constructed narrative Zane had presented during their courtship. When the video ended, Hessa sat motionless for several minutes, processing not just the revelation of the relationship, which, given her understanding of Gulf business dynamics, was hardly surprising, but the implications of how it had been handled. She noted the date on the email, correlating it with the subsequent day's events, particularly Zane's uncharacteristic nervousness during their engagement dinner and his sudden cancellation of their lunch meeting the day after Belle's disappearance. The pattern emerging was not one of infidelity, which might have been navigated within the established parameters of their arranged marriage, but of panic, poor judgment, and potentially something far more damaging, actions taken to silence rather than simply distance. Hessa's response was not emotional but strategic. She used her family's considerable resources to conduct a discreet but thorough investigation, accessing security camera footage from the industrial zone, obtaining cell phone location data through unofficial channels, reviewing police reports marked as routine. The picture that emerged, though circumstantial, was sufficiently clear to confirm her suspicions. Belle Cruz had not simply disappeared but had been deliberately removed, with Zane's knowledge if not direct instruction. In patriarchal power structures, the most dangerous miscalculation men often make is underestimating women's intelligence networks, notes political scientist Dr. Samira Al-Faisal. The same systems that officially restrict women's authority often create shadow channels of information sharing, alliance building, and strategic response that operate beneath the visible exercise of male power. What appears as acceptance or ignorance is frequently sophisticated assessment and calculated patience. Hessa's confrontation with Zane occurred not in public but in the controlled environment of his DIFC office, her security detail ensuring their privacy, while her father's position guaranteed her safety. She entered without appointment, dismissing his assistant with a gesture that brooked no argument, and placed a tablet on his desk displaying the police report of the Jebel Ali fire alongside Belle's video testimony. "You let them burn her alive to protect your pride?" she asked, her voice carrying not the emotional outrage of a betrayed fiancé, but the cold assessment of a strategic partner reevaluating an investment. Zane's response, a carefully constructed denial about having no knowledge of specific actions taken by overzealous security personnel, collapsed under the weight of Hesse's silent, unwavering gaze. She had not come to hear explanations but to deliver a verdict. "Our marriage will proceed as planned," she said finally, her tone making clear this was not forgiveness but calculation. "The contracts are signed. The announcements made. The alliance benefits both our families. But understand this clearly, you will never touch me. You will never have children with me. And your media licenses will be transferred to holding companies under my direct control within 30 days of our wedding." The terms were not negotiable, the consequences of refusal implicit but unmistakable. Zayn, who had built an empire on his ability to read power dynamics, recognized the position in which he now found himself, trapped by his own actions in an arrangement that would provide the public appearance he required while ensuring his functional surrender of control to the very woman he had sought to deceive. The reconfiguration of power after significant moral transgression often occurs privately rather than publicly, observes corporate ethics specialist Dr. Jonathan Chun. What appears externally as business as usual frequently masks internal restructuring where authority has shifted dramatically. The public narrative remains intact while operational reality transforms completely, a face-saving mechanism that allows systems to adjust without acknowledging the failures that necessitated change. In the weeks that followed, Hesse's quiet power manifested in ways invisible to outside observers but unmistakable to those directly affected. Through channels available to a woman of her position, she ensured 3 consequential actions occurred without public attribution. First, Zayn's media licenses began experiencing administrative reviews, resulting in revocation for technical irregularities, a bloodless corporate execution that decimated his empire while maintaining the fiction of regulatory procedure rather than personal retribution. Second, anonymous funds were channeled to Belle Cruz's treatment program in Cebu, ensuring not just continuation but enhancement of her care, including experimental therapies previously unavailable due to cost constraints. Third, through connections with Interpol and regional security forces, she arranged for Rashid's arrest in Oman on charges entirely unrelated to Belle's case. Arms trafficking allegations supported by evidence that appeared with convenient timing in intelligence databases. None of these actions directly acknowledged Belle's existence or fate. None explicitly connected to the events in Jebel Ali or the relationship that had precipitated them. Yet each represented a form of accountability executed with the precision of someone who understood that justice, like power, sometimes operated most effectively through indirect channels. 1 month after Belle's disappearance, a package arrived at Belle Cruz's hospital room in Cebu. It contained Belle's diary, her Cartier bracelet, a gift from Zayn on their 2nd anniversary, and a handwritten note on expensive stationery bearing no signature or return address. "Your daughter mattered." Lourdes held the bracelet against her chest, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. "I know, Anik," she whispered to the empty room, using the Tagalog endearment for child. "I always knew." The diary's pages contained Belle's private reflections on her relationship with Zayn, her hopes for their future, her growing recognition of the compromises she had made. The final entry, dated 2 days before her disappearance, revealed a woman coming to terms with difficult truths. "I thought love made me special, an exception to the rules that govern women like me in this world. But I'm beginning to understand that true dignity isn't found in exceptions granted by powerful men, but in refusing to make our humanity conditional on their recognition." This quiet wisdom, preserved in Belle's own handwriting, would eventually become the foundation for something her death had sought to prevent. A lasting acknowledgement that her life, her choices, and her courage mattered not just personally but systemically. A recognition that would emerge not through the justice system that had failed her but through the unexpected conscience of the very woman whose arrival had precipitated her erasure. If this unflinching examination of power, accountability, and the unexpected channels through which truth sometimes survives has resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for our final segment. As we move forward 1 year to witness the lasting impact of Belle's courage, we discover that some names refuse to be erased, some truths cannot be silenced, and some legacies emerge from the very systems designed to prevent them. 1 year after the fire in Jebel Ali, St. Teresa's Church in Dubai's Oud Method district was illuminated by morning sunlight filtering through stained glass, casting pools of colored light across polished wooden pews. The small Filipino congregation had gathered for Sunday Mass, the familiar rituals providing comfort and connection to a community bound by shared faith and the common experience of building lives far from home. Among the worshippers sat a woman whose face was partially obscured by an elegant hijab, Sheikh Hessa, now officially Hessa Al-Mirza, though she used her maiden name in all business dealings. Her presence in this modest church, far from the grand mosques frequented by Emirati elites, would have surprised those who knew her only through official channels. But over the past year, Hessa had developed an unexpected connection to this particular congregation, not through conversion or religious curiosity, but through a shared link to a woman whose name was rarely spoken aloud yet whose absence shaped the lives of many present. Moral reckonings often manifest in unexpected spiritual explorations, observes interfaith scholar Dr. Fatima Rahman. For individuals processing complicity or proximity to injustice, religious spaces associated with the victim sometimes become sites of complex emotional processing, not necessarily seeking forgiveness or absolution, but attempting to understand the moral framework that sustained the person who was harmed, to connect with the values that guided their choices. As the service concluded, Hessa remained seated while others filed out, her security detail maintaining discreet positions near the exits. Father Santos, the elderly Filipino priest who had ministered to this congregation for over 2 decades, approached her pew with the careful respect her position commanded, but also the gentle directness of someone accustomed to addressing souls rather than social status. "You honor us with your presence again, Your Excellency," he said quietly. Hessa nodded, her response equally low. "I received confirmation yesterday. The center will open next month in Manila. Everything is arranged as we discussed." The center referenced was the Belle Cruz Center for Migrant Women's Rights, a comprehensive support facility in Manila providing legal assistance, employment advocacy, and emergency intervention for overseas Filipino workers facing exploitation or abuse. Funded through an anonymous foundation that financial journalists had tried and failed to connect to any known entity, the center represented a substantial investment in addressing the systemic vulnerabilities that had contributed to Belle's death. Most significant was the decision to name the facility openly and officially after Belle, her photograph prominently displayed in the entrance hall, her story, carefully edited to protect certain legal sensitivities, presented as the inspiration for its mission. This public acknowledgement of her existence, her experience, and her courage stood as a direct challenge to the erasure that had been attempted in the industrial zone fire. Notably absent from any official materials was any mention of Zain al-Mirza, whose connection to Belle remained unacknowledged in public records despite being known to those most directly involved. This selective silence was not protective but punitive, ensuring that while Belle's name would be remembered and honored, the man responsible for her death would receive no recognition, not even as villain in her story. Memorialization serves multiple functions in the aftermath of injustice, explains cultural memory specialist Dr. Elena Vasquez. Beyond honoring the victim, it creates permanent institutional records that resist future erasure attempts. By embedding a name within organizational structures, within mission statements, within physical buildings, we ensure that disappearance, both literal and historical, becomes more difficult to achieve. The name becomes infrastructure rather than merely memory. Father Santos handed Hessa a small package wrapped in simple blue cloth. "Lourdes asked me to give you this when the center was confirmed. She said you would understand its significance." Inside the package was Belle's silver voice recorder, retrieved from the wreckage of the Lexus and eventually returned to her mother through channels that remained undefined. The device, though damaged by heat, still contained her final message. The simple, powerful request to be remembered by her name, not as an appendage to someone else's story. Hessa accepted the recorder with a slight inclination of her head, an acknowledgement of both the gift's weight and the trust it represented. Her involvement with Belle's legacy remained officially unacknowledged, her weekly visits to this church undocumented in any public record, her connection to the Manila Center technically unprovable. This deliberate separation between action and attribution allowed her to maintain her position within the complex power structures of Emirati society, while simultaneously working to address the injustice those same structures had facilitated. Across the city, in a modest apartment in Sharjah's Al-Qasimiya district, Zain al-Mirza sat alone at a small table, watching a live stream on his tablet. The event was the groundbreaking ceremony for the Belle Cruz Center in Manila, attended by Filipino government officials, international human rights representatives, and Belle Cruz, now in remission from the cancer that had once threatened her life. The camera panned across the ceremonial site, lingering on the architectural rendering of the completed building, a modern structure whose entrance would feature Belle's name in both English and Tagalog lettering. Zane's fall had been as swift as it was complete. Within 6 months of his marriage to Hessa, his media empire had disintegrated. Licenses revoked, partnerships dissolved, investments devalued. His public explanation centered on strategic realignment and focus on personal projects. But industry insiders recognized the systematic dismantling of what had once been one of the region's most powerful media conglomerates. The villa on Palm Jumeirah had been sold, the penthouse in DIFC relinquished as part of complex financial restructuring. His current apartment, while comfortable by ordinary standards, represented a stunning step down from the opulence that had previously defined his existence. Most telling was his social isolation. The business associates, political connections, and cultural elites who had once sought his company now maintained careful distance, sensing that whatever had caused his downfall might be contagious through association. The social death that follows certain forms of disgrace often precedes any formal accusation or public exposure, notes sociologist Dr. Tariq Al-Jabri. Power networks operate through subtle signals rather than explicit communications. When someone who once occupied a central position suddenly experiences coordinated withdrawal of access and opportunity, it indicates a shared understanding that this person has violated fundamental norms, not necessarily legal statutes, but the unwritten codes that govern elite cohesion. Zane closed the live stream before the speeches began, unable to bear Lourdes' dignified presence, her resemblance to Belle too painful to observe. He moved to the window overlooking the street below, so different from the panoramic vistas that had once served as the backdrop to his life. The past year had stripped away not just his wealth and influence but his carefully constructed self-narrative. The story of a strategic visionary whose every action served a greater purpose, whose choices were justified by their contribution to a legacy of significance. That morning, he had done something he had been contemplating for months, but had lacked the courage to execute. He had visited the Philippine consulate, leaving a single white orchid, Belle's favorite flower, with the security guard at the entrance. No note, no explanation, no request for the flower to be placed anywhere specific. Just the small, inadequate gesture of someone trying to acknowledge a debt that could never be repaid, a wrong that could never be made right. What Zane could not know was that the security guard, recognizing him despite his diminished circumstances, had immediately reported the incident to his superiors. By afternoon, the information had traveled through the complex networks connecting Dubai's Filipino community, eventually reaching Father Santos, who added it to his mental catalog of developments surrounding Belle's story. The priest made no judgment, offered no interpretation, merely noted the action as another data point in the continuing impact of a life that had seemed, at the moment of its violent extinction, to have been successfully erased. On a beach in Cebu, as the Manila ceremony concluded, Belle Cruz sat watching the sunset with Maricel, Belle's childhood friend who had supported her through the darkest days following her daughter's disappearance. They had come to release paper lanterns, a Filipino tradition for remembering the departed, each glowing vessel carrying messages of love and remembrance into the darkening sky. Lured hands, steadier now than they had been during her illness, carefully prepared her lantern, attaching a small handwritten card to its frame before lighting the fuel cell that would give it flight. As the paper structure inflated with warm air, the message became visible. Belle, seen, known, remembered. The lantern rose slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as the thermal dynamics established themselves, the small light joining others already ascending, creating a constellation of memory against the twilight canvas. Lourdes watched until it became indistinguishable from the emerging stars, her expression reflecting not just grief but a complex peace. The understanding that while justice in its conventional form had been denied, her daughter's truth had survived, her name preserved, her dignity affirmed in ways that transcended the silence that had been intended as her final state. The persistence of memory often confounds systems designed to enforce forgetting, observes grief researcher Dr. Maya Patel. When we light lanterns, create foundations, speak names that powerful interests would prefer to erase. We are not just honoring individuals but challenging the mechanisms that allow certain lives to be categorized as disposable. These acts of remembrance become forms of resistance, asserting that every life deserves recognition, every story deserves telling, every name deserves to be preserved regardless of who finds that preservation inconvenient. As darkness settled over the Philippine Sea, Lourdes turned to Maricel with a small, sad smile. "She always worried about being forgotten," she said quietly. "Even as a child, she would make me promise to remember her stories exactly as she told them." Maricel nodded, her own eyes reflecting the memory of a young Belle insisting on precision, on acknowledgement, on being seen as she was rather than as others might prefer to imagine her. "She would be proud of the center," she replied, "not just because it bears her name, but because it will help others like her, women whose stories deserve to be heard, whose lives deserve to be protected." The center represented something Belle had sought throughout her relationship with Zayn, not fame or fortune or even conventional justice, but simply the dignity of being acknowledged as fully human, her existence valued not for its utility to powerful interests but for its inherent worth. In establishing this legacy, those who had loved her, and even those who had come to care for her only after her death, had achieved something the flames in Jebel Ali had been specifically designed to prevent: the preservation of her truth beyond her physical existence. They had tried to burn her into silence, to reduce her to ash and bone fragments too damaged for identification, to erase her from official records and public memory. But some names refuse to turn to ash. Some truths persist beyond the physical vessels that first carried them. Some stories continue to resonate long after those who lived them have been taken from the world. Belle Cruz, daughter, friend, woman of principle, had disappeared from the physical world in flames meant to consume not just her body but her truth. Yet her name now adorned a building in Manila. Her story informed international advocacy efforts. Her memory lived in a community of people committed to ensuring that what happened to her would not happen unnoticed to others. The ultimate victory was not vengeance but visibility, the very thing she had requested in that fateful email that had cost her everything and ultimately secured her legacy. In examining cases like Belle's, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, vulnerability, and the systems that determine whose lives are valued and whose deaths are investigated, reflects human rights attorney James Morrison. But we also glimpse something profoundly hopeful: the persistent human capacity for moral courage, the refusal to be defined by systems of oppression, the way individual acts of principle can eventually catalyze collective recognition and change. These stories remind us that while power can eliminate people, it cannot so easily eliminate the truth they stood for. Next time you see a news item about a foreign worker who has disappeared without explanation, a domestic employee whose death is quickly classified as accident or suicide, or a woman whose relationship with a powerful man ends in convenient tragedy, remember Belle Cruz. Remember that behind each statistic is a human being with dreams, relationships, and dignity that deserves recognition. Remember that some silences are not the absence of sound but the active suppression of voices deemed inconvenient to established narratives. And remember that sometimes, against all odds, these suppressed voices find ways to echo beyond their silencing. Through foundations bearing their names, through communities preserving their stories, through simple paper lanterns rising against the night sky carrying 3 words that defy the most sophisticated machinery of erasure. Seen, known, remembered. If this exploration of power, vulnerability, and the dignity of being acknowledged has affected you as I hope it has, please take a moment to share Belle's story. Not because it will change systems overnight, but because awareness is the first step toward accountability, and memory is the first act of justice. Sometimes bearing witness is the only form of justice initially available, and from that witness, unexpected change can eventually emerge.